focus on, and I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies and the Professor of Cultural Studies at Charles Darwin University, and welcome to this, our first stage of a flipped training session. And this session explores authorship and the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. So this is a flipped session. I'm presenting some information for you today for your reflection, and then we'll meet for a synchronous session to probe some scenarios that are appropriate for you, your discipline, and your particular stage of a career. For many of us, the reasons we decide to become an academic are an amalgam of motivations, inspirations and aspirations, but we have to have a belief in the future, a belief in the next generation of academics. That belief guides our teaching, our research and our supervision. We write because we wish to connect our current research to the future of scholarship. Research can and should create profound intellectual generosity. But yes, it also summons jealousy, cruelty, brutality, envy, and, let's be frank, theft. This topic, authorship, upsets me. And indeed, it upsets higher degree students. About 25% of the students that have seen me in my office in my last 3 roles in Australia and overseas have raised issues with authorship, and particularly authorship with their PhD supervisors. So this is not a Charles Darwin University issue. This is an international academic issue. But Australia did have a different pathway into our discussions of authorship and research codes of conduct. Australia's research culture, up to very recently, tethered funding to the amount of published research. The RAE and the REF in the United Kingdom were quality-driven rather than the number of articles. So in the RAE in particular, a scholar presented the 4 best pieces that they had published in the preceding 5 years. So because of this system, it encouraged academics to conduct independent research with senior scholars, and they really had to be the primary or the first author. But because Australia was driven by the number of publications for the first decade of the 21st century, it has skewed many of our discussions about authorship. But now we are in different times. So how do we understand these different times? How do we acknowledge our past? And that's a past where many of us were exploited. And how do we understand the clear regulations that are in place now? There is an old trick in research that involves us asking 2 questions. And the first question is always, what changed? And the second question is, what happens next? In 2018, the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research was released. It was a revision of the previous code, and the 2018 version set out particular broad principles, confirming an honest, ethical and conscientious research culture. And that culture existed for our researchers, but also for our higher education institutions. All national funding, including from the NHMRC, must adhere to the code. And it's also crucial to research training. In December 2019, the NHMRC, the ARC and Universities Australia released a document titled Supervision, a guide supporting the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. This is a powerful document. It's also a freely available document. And to be frank, all the excuses are over. There is no courtesy authorship. There is no, this is the way it's always been done in my discipline, therefore you have to put my name on your article. That's over. These unjust practices are now in breach of the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. So the new code was released in 2018 with very clear instructions for authorship and very clear requirements for what is necessary to prove, to verify that you are an author. I'll read you item 6 from the 2019 Supervision Guide. Quote, examples of breaches of the code that are related to supervision include, but are not limited to, failure by a supervisor to provide adequate guidance or mentorship on the responsible conduct of research to researchers or research trainees under their supervision, or demanding or accepting authorship of a research output on the basis of supervision, where the individual does not also satisfy the authorship criteria in the authorship code. End of quote. Most of us through our academic lives around the world have seen pretty dreadful behaviour around academic authorship, but Australia now, today, has powerful and strong guidelines. Just because you supervise, that has nothing to do with authorship. Nothing. You have to prove. You have to verify your authorship by a set of criteria. And these verification protocols are important. They're between academic colleagues and also with our students. It is important that these discussions emerge early in the candidature or at the very foundation of a research project, and these agreements must be handled with decency, transparency and respect. Remember that in the Australian system, the higher degree students own their own IP unless they sign it away, and those contracts need to be signed by the students early. If there are industry partnerships, then alternative IP collaborations are in place. But without this contract or agreement, students own their IP. There are plenty of assumptions about authorship, particularly tethered to research supervision, and I still hear supervisors and prospective supervisors around this country state that if they supervise a person, then they expect authorship credit. Okay. Well, if that's your expectation, then we have to talk about that in terms of the research code of conduct. But you see, assumptions are not enough. There are requirements for any of us to be listed as an author. Assumptions in the doctoral space are damaging. My PhD supervisor, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, told me that he wanted authorship on all my articles. He didn't read a word of the thesis, he didn't develop the topic, he didn't have any say at all in the research questions, he didn't have any say in the research materials deployed or the interpretation. He didn't read it. So I laughed at him and said no. And I published 9 articles directly from that thesis and another 6 based on that research, all solely authored. My research master's in education that I completed while I was a full professor in the United Kingdom holding a British chair was even more bonkers. I did a 50,000-word dissertation completely on my own, no input from the supervisor at all, not a single meeting, not a single email. But I sent her the full and complete thesis the day before I submitted it as a professional courtesy. And that was the first time that she saw it. And she said in a returned email, "I'll need to be the co-author on anything you publish from it." Now, I laughed out loud. I laughed for a long time. And then I realised that she was serious, so I then simply sent on her email to her dean and the DVC. And interestingly, both of them were very uncomfortable, but confirmed that there were no grounds for authorship. Now, these stories emerged before the current code. Determinations of authorship are much clearer now because all of us have lived this academic history. So the reason I've told you these stories is we need to make sure we understand our legacy that we're bringing to these conversations and recognise that that history, that legacy and these assumptions must now change. I am very staunch in my rights as an author, and I'm also a very staunch protector of my students' rights as authors. In their first meeting with me, I specify clearly, if I write it, it is mine. If you write it, it is yours. If we write it together, it is shared, and let's talk about the ordering of authorship. But I have one more story that I want to share with you where, in many ways, my staunch stance crumbled. So I was a full professor, British chair in the British RAE system. Now, I was in my first year of employment on probation for British tenure. And I was brought into a meeting with a very senior manager at that university. And he said to me clearly, I need a fourth article for the RAE. I don't have time to write it, and you'll need to write it and add my name to it. His other 3 articles, he was the third author of 3. So I think you get the picture. So I worked 18-hour days and finished that article in a week. I presented it to him, and you'll love this bit. He said, I don't know if I agree with it. And I said, no worries, I wrote it. I'll claim authorship. It's mine anyway. And at that point, he backtracked. He was so desperate to enter into the RAE that he added his authorship to a piece that he didn't even like. Now, once more, that story was before the current code. And I'm telling you these stories because authorship and demanding the rights of authorship are about power. Power. Me, as a full professor, I had to manage the power of a senior academic manager in a foreign country while I was on probation. So you can see why I care so deeply about authorship, power, and the need for governance. We need protocols. We need codes of conduct. So let's move beyond these experiences, our personal histories, and go into policy, go into the governance that must now guide our actions. The Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research is clear. There are 3 requirements to claim authorship, and these elements all require a quote-unquote substantial contribution, end of quote, to 2 of the 3 following elements. Element 1, conception and design of the project. Element 2, analysis and interpretation of research data. Element 3, drafting significant parts of the work or critically revising it so that it contributes to the interpretation. Right, so this matters. It's also important to recognise the subtle difference between supervising a research project and publishing from that research project. We can assist in the configuration of research questions for a PhD, but that is different from designing the project in the refereed article. This ambiguity is what intensifies the anger, the confusion, and the jealousy in the authorship space. And one of my most horrible moments working in higher education was when I was a head of school and I heard a junior staff member, a B-level academic who had the privilege of supervising a PhD student, telling a friend and pretty well everybody else in the corridor who could hear her, that unless her PhD student told her that she would be a co-author on every article, then she wouldn't even open up the file to read the chapter of her PhD. So this is the ambiguity between reading a draft of a thesis and being an author on a refereed publication. And that ambiguity must now be critiqued. Drafting a PhD chapter does not connote authorship, and it does not connote authorship by the Australian Code of Conduct. You are not an author through drafting. For me, there are a continuum of reasons why academics supervise, and that moves from profound selfishness to profound intellectual generosity. So you're supervising because you get a lot out of it, or you're supervising because you're giving back to higher education. Now, all of us are on that continuum somewhere. So think about it in terms of your own life. Where are you on that continuum? It is important that we all ask ourselves, why are we supervising? Now, on the selfish end, and there's a bit of danger, Will Robinson danger here, let me play devil's advocate. You are supervising the student because they're enabling your research. You're supervising students so that you can cruise through, get some easy publications on the back of a student's work. Now, I see that so often. And to avoid this situation, we need to have conversations with our students about IP, about authorship and about ownership, and we need to talk about overtly the Research Code of Conduct, authorship policies, guidelines, procedures. And we really do need to ask ourselves, what sort of academic are you if you need to leverage the work of students? Now, I'm being provocative here because I do want to provoke you. Are you a supervisor because you're interested in what you can get from your students? So please be honest with yourself if that characteristic exists within you. And then start to be honest with your students right from the start. I know I've been staunch here, but I can't convey to you the scale of the horror stories I've seen and I've heard in the last decade or so, where students have simply lost control of their own research, their own words, because supervisors sucked up that material into their own CV. There are positive reasons to supervise. It is a joy to work with brilliant people and explore fresh ideas. And supervision is also a way to pay back higher education for the gifts that it's given us all, sharing our expertise, our skills, our abilities with the next generation. This is the apprenticeship model. This is the mentorship model. I know that each discipline has customs and practices and behaviours, but it is important to recognise that in Australia today, authorship is regulated by a national code, regardless of discipline. So if authorship is mishandled, then researchers are opening themselves up to claims of unethical conduct and being in breach of the code. So I'll tell you about the process that occurs. So if anyone, including our students, a member of the public, believes there has been a breach of the code, what happens? Let me tell you. Right. So the person that believes there's been a breach of the code writes to the DVCR with their complaint. So a breach has now been reported, and the breach must identify specific details and include evidence to enable that potential breach to be assessed. It is important to remember it is an evidence-driven process. All complaints must be honest, and malicious complaints may be moved to other university policies. The complaints are confidential, except if there is legal action in place, and procedural fairness may require that the identity of the complainant is revealed. Anonymous reports will be investigated, but the challenge is there sufficient information to enable an investigation? Information about the breach is passed on to the designated officer, the DO, who at CDU is the DVCR research, unless there is a conflict of interest, and it is passed to another colleague. The designated officer then passes all information on to an assessment officer, an AO. And on most occasions, when investigating a case involving an HDR student, I will be the assessment officer unless I have a conflict of interest, and then one of the colleagues probably listening to this sonic session will end up the AO, the assessment officer. The assessment officer gathers information on the case from all parties, deploys text matching software if at all possible, and then assesses if the complaint, and this is important language, would constitute a breach. So this is an evidence-driven process, and this preliminary investigation, this preliminary assessment must be completed within 10 working days. The assessment officer then informs the designated officer of the preliminary assessment based on evidence and within the balance of possibilities. So a recommendation is then offered from the AO for the following three options. There's a case to answer, it's referred to other institutional processes, or the complaint is dismissed. So the designated officer then informs the respondent of the outcomes of this preliminary assessment. And if there is a case to answer, the designated officer then implements the next stage of the process. And that involves ascertaining if the complaint can be resolved locally with a consensual outcome, refer the case to investigation, refer the case to other institutional processes such as bullying or harassment processes, or indeed at that stage the complaint can be dismissed. If the designated officer recommends an investigation, then the responsible executive officer, the Vice-Chancellor, appoints an investigation panel. This panel reports to the VC. The investigation panel can determine the following outcomes. They can locate a breach of the code. They can locate no breach of the code. And if no breach to the code is determined, then the allegation is either dismissed or referred to other institutional processes. The determination and recommendations of action following an investigation from the responsible executive officer, the VC, result in, firstly, corrective actions being implemented, and that may involve the retraction of a publication or the correction of a public record, such as the addition or the removal of authors. It can also involve disciplinary action under employment agreements, policies and procedures. A review of this investigation on the grounds of procedural fairness can be requested by any party, and for example in the Northern Territory that can involve ICAC. Now I've given you that narrative not to frighten you, although it is incredibly frightening, but I want to explain to you what happens in response to every single complaint that is sent to the DVCR stating that there has been a breach in the Code of Research Conduct. Wow. So how exactly did we end up here? Well, let me give you one research finding that shows you precisely how we ended up here. Whistler et al. Reported in a study of 6 prestigious medical journals that 1 in 4 articles had an unjustified author, and 1 in every 10 articles did not include an author that should have been listed. So what this research shows is this is not about a few bad apples. This is not about the occasional lapse. This, colleagues, is our culture. This is our academic culture. And our culture has to change. Authorship matters because it holds academic, social and financial power. It is tethered to responsibility and accountability. Increasingly, of course, journals are asking for clear and published information about the contribution of each person named as an author and asking for what exactly have they done, how have they participated in this process. And I am so in favour of that protocol. And as we remember, authorship has 3 parts: research design, data collection and interpretation, and substantive writing and editing. To be an author on a publication, you must verify, you must prove 2 of these 3 roles. Authorship must be discussed not only before an article is published, but actually before a student is enrolled in a higher degree program. Supervisors must be honest. What are your expectations about authorship with your students? And this is not only higher degree students, this is honours students, this is undergraduate students. What are your expectations about authorship with your students? Do you assume that you will simply add your name? Why? Where has that assumption come from? Now I understand the past expectations that we all live through. I understand that. I acknowledge that. I hear you. I speak to that pain and that injustice. But colleagues, it was wrong then. And now it is regulated through a clear code of conduct. Now, this code does have a history. The Vancouver Protocol commenced with a small group of editors of general medical journals who met in Vancouver in 1978. And they became the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. So authorship in the Vancouver Protocol was determined as, and this is important, I think, we need to go back to this. In the Vancouver Protocol, authorship was determined as sufficient to take public responsibility for the content. It requires, and you'll notice the synergies and the similarities with the current Australian Code, but the Vancouver Protocol required substantial contribution to the conception and design or analysis and interpretation of data, drafting of the article or revising it critically for intellectual content, and yes, final approval of the published version. If contributors did not meet this criteria, then they were listed not as authors, but they were acknowledged. Sourcing funding, data collection, or running the samples, that was not enough. The VP also recommends that the reason for the ordering of the authorship should be explained in a footnote. And this is important. This is not about humanities versus social science or humanities versus science at all. In fact, if you think about it, mathematics is probably the outlier to our conversation, with mathematic publications, of course, listed alphabetically, so the Hardy-Littlewood protocol. So all authors in mathematics publications are equal rather than the first author is the dominant one. Now that's fine. For my mathematics colleagues out there, you are wonderful. Hardy-Littlewood's in place. But by the current code of conduct, you require a footnote to state overtly that Hardy-Littlewood is in place. But the Vancouver Protocol was configured for medical sciences. The Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research operates through all academic disciplines. And the challenge we have in doctoral education is the leader of the project often determines the order of the authors, and young researchers are disempowered in these environments. So let me finish our presentation before we start our flipped conversation. Let me finish with a final story. And this is something that happened to me this year. I was one of 5 authors for a book that was signed to a British publisher. Now, I wrote my 3 chapters and waited for the other authors to complete their work. Now, I'd pretty well finished the introduction, but obviously I needed the other authors to finish their chapters to make sure that I'd configured the introduction correctly. But then, without any of those other chapters being produced, one of the co-authors decided to do an edit of one of my chapters, adding about half a paragraph and about 3 references that I could not agree to and I could not agree with. And remember, one of the requirements of authorship is that we agree to the content and we are responsible for it. We must agree to be an author. So this co-author added references and a perspective on identity that I could not agree with, and I could not attach my name to it. So I pulled out of the project. And as I wrote 1/3 of the book, the entire book project collapsed. This is the seriousness of authorship. If we add ideas to someone else's work that they cannot agree to or with, then the project stops. Authorship requires that we agree to be an author, and these decisions that we make or that others make are serious and can be debilitating for our career. I was a full professor and a dean when I pulled out of that project to abide by the code. Being a researcher demands both rights and responsibilities, and I look forward to working with you in our seminars where we together will work through scenarios to understand the transformative landscape of Australian research. Thank you so much for your time. Be well.